June 19, 1943, dawned with the acrid smell of burning metal over England's airfields, a scent that Colonel Malcolm Grow had come to despise with every fiber of his being. As chief surgeon of the 8th Air Force, he stood in the surgical tent at Thorpe Abbott's, his white coat splattered with the blood of yet another young bombardier who wouldn't see his 20th birthday. The boy's chest had been torn open by flak fragments no larger than a man's thumbnail, yet deadly as any bullet forged in the foundries of the Third Reich. The mathematics of aerial warfare had become a gruesome accounting ledger. For every 100 bombers that roared across the English Channel toward Germany's industrial heartland, 30 would never return. Those that limped back often carried dead or dying crew members, their bodies shredded by the steel fragments of anti-aircraft shells that exploded around them at 20,000 feet. The flying fortresses and liberators might have been named for their durability, but the men inside them were as vulnerable as sparrows caught in a hailstorm. Grow had served in the Great War, had seen the trenches of France, but nothing had prepared him for this industrial-scale slaughter in the sky. Each mission briefing meant calculating which of the bright-faced young Americans he'd patched up last week would be wheeled into his operating theater this week. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids alone had cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers in a single day, each carrying 10 men. 600 souls, most of them barely old enough to vote, ripped apart by high-explosive shells designed specifically to destroy aircraft and everyone inside them. The official response from command had been predictably bureaucratic: accept the casualties as the necessary price of strategic bombing. The generals in their comfortable offices spoke of acceptable loss rates and mission effectiveness ratios, as if dead airmen were merely numbers in a strategic equation. But Grow wasn't a statistician shuffling papers in some headquarters bunker. He was a surgeon who looked into the eyes of dying boys and knew their names, their hometowns, their girlfriends' names. He'd written too many letters to mothers in Iowa and Texas, explaining how their sons had died bravely for their country, when the truth was they'd simply bled out in the freezing air over Germany, killed by metal fragments that a simple steel plate might have stopped. The genesis of his obsession came from a wound pattern he couldn't ignore. 70% of casualties among bomber crews were caused by low-velocity flak fragments hitting the torso. These weren't high-powered rifle bullets that would pierce any reasonable armor. These were relatively slow-moving chunks of shrapnel that transferred their killing energy through blunt trauma and penetration of vital organs. A surgeon's mind worked differently than a soldier's. Where others saw inevitable casualties, Grow saw a medical problem with an engineering solution. The medieval knights had understood this principle 6 centuries earlier, yet somehow the most advanced military in the world was sending men into battle protected by nothing more than leather jackets. According to research documented in military medical journals of the period, particularly the comprehensive studies later published in the Army Medical Department's official histories, Colonel Grow began conducting his own unofficial investigation into protective equipment possibilities. August 7, 1943 marked the beginning of what military bureaucracy would later classify as unauthorized procurement and distribution of non-standard equipment, but what Malcolm Grow considered simple common sense wrapped in steel. He'd spent the previous 6 weeks studying metallurgy reports, consulting with engineers at the Wilkinson Sword Company in London, and most importantly, collecting flak fragments from damaged aircraft and wounded bodies. His collection had grown macabre, a cigar box filled with twisted metal pieces, each one tagged with the name of the airman it had killed or wounded. The British had already developed body armor for their own bomber crews, the Mark 14 and Mark 15 vests, but these were cumbersome affairs weighing nearly 30 pounds, designed for the slower-moving Lancaster and Halifax bombers. American B-17 and B-24 crews needed something lighter, more flexible, something that wouldn't impede their movement in the cramped confines of their aircraft positions. Grow knew that if he went through official channels, requesting approval from the Army Air Force's headquarters, then the Ordnance Department, then the War Department in Washington, the approval process would take months, possibly years. Men were dying by the dozens every week. He didn't have months. So the colonel made a decision that could have ended his career. He would commission the armor himself and worry about official approval later. Using his medical supply budget and calling in favors from British contacts, he arranged a meeting with the Wilkinson Sword Company's chief engineer, a brilliant metallurgist named Clifford Simmons, who'd spent the previous year developing lightweight armor solutions for British commandos. Grow presented his collection of flak fragments, his casualty data, and his proposition: design a vest that could stop these specific threats, weighing no more than 20 pounds, capable of being worn for 8 to 10 hours during bombing missions. Simmons studied the fragments through a jeweler's loupe, conducting hardness tests and examining the deformation patterns. The answer, he concluded, lay not in thick steel plates, but in overlapping manganese steel plates, each 1/8 of an inch thick, arranged in a configuration that would allow flexibility while providing protection to vital organs. The design borrowed from ancient Roman lorica segmentata armor, with the steel segments attached to a canvas vest that distributed the weight across the shoulders and torso. It wouldn't stop a direct hit from large-caliber anti-aircraft guns, but it would defeat the 70% of wounds that were currently killing bomber crews. The first prototype was completed on September 2, 1943. Grow himself wore it for 12 hours straight, performing surgery, climbing in and out of aircraft, even running across the airfield to test its practicality. The vest weighed 22 pounds, 2 more than his target, but he deemed it acceptable. The real test would come from the men who had to ear it in combat. He selected 10 crews from the 351st Bomb Group, explaining honestly that this was experimental equipment, not officially approved, and that wearing it was entirely voluntary. Every single man volunteered. The reasoning was simple mathematics that even the youngest enlisted man could understand. The vest might be uncomfortable, might cause fatigue, might even be ineffective, but wearing it gave them a chance that standard-issue leather jackets never could. On September 10, 1943, those 10 crews flew a mission to bomb aircraft factories in Stuttgart, Germany, through some of the heaviest flak concentrations in the European theater. September 10, 1943 became the day that validated Malcolm Grow's unauthorized gamble with a clarity that no military report could dispute. The Stuttgart mission had been brutal, exactly the kind of operation that turned young men's hair gray before their time. 200 DB-17s had flown through walls of black flak bursts over southern Germany, the sky so thick with exploding shells that pilots later swore they could have walked on the smoke. Of the 10 crews wearing Grow's experimental vests, 9 aircraft returned, many so riddled with holes they looked like flying colanders. In the debriefing room at Thorpe Abbott's, the evidence was overwhelming. Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison, a waist gunner from Ohio, unbuttoned his vest to reveal 17 separate impact points where flak fragments had struck him directly in the chest and abdomen. Without he vest, any one of those hits would likely have been fatal. Instead, Morrison had bruises the size of dinner plates, cracked ribs from the blunt trauma, but he was alive and already demanding to fly the next mission. His vest looked like it had been used for target practice, the steel plates dented and gouged, but not a single fragment had penetrated through to his body. Technical Sergeant James Dougherty, a ball turret gunner who'd flown 23 missions without injury, had always considered himself lucky until the Stuttgart raid. A flak burst directly beneath his turret had sent dozens of fragments upward through the aircraft's thin aluminum belly. Large pieces had struck him in the lower torso, an impact he described as being kicked by a mule. The steel plates caught every fragment. His vest was retired to Grow's growing collection of battlefield evidence, and Dougherty, despite painful bruising, was already asking for a replacement vest for his next mission. The statistical evidence was even more compelling than the individual testimonies. Of the 90 men wearing the vests on that mission, 14 had sustained direct hits that would have caused serious wounds or death without protection. Not a single one required evacuation or extended medical treatment beyond observation for blunt trauma injuries. Grow documented each case with photographs, detailed medical reports, and interviews with the crew members. He knew he'd need this evidence when the inevitable confrontation with military bureaucracy arrived. Word spread through the bomber groups faster than official communications ever traveled. Within days, crews who'd heard about the Stuttgart mission results were appearing at Grow's medical headquarters, asking, demanding, sometimes begging for the vests. He had only 40 sets available from his initial order, enough for 4 crews. The decision of who would receive this potentially life-saving equipment became an impossible ethical dilemma. Should it go to the most experienced crews, whose survival skills might be complemented by the armor? Or to the newest crews, who were statistically most likely to make fatal mistakes? Should veteran crews who'd already survived 20 missions have priority over men flying their first? Grow solved the problem by establishing a rotation system. Vests would be issued to crews flying the most dangerous missions, those targeting heavily defended industrial areas deep in Germany. After each mission, the vests would be inspected, repaired if necessary, and redistributed. As inefficient and imperfect, but it meant more men had a chance at survival. The bomber crews, typically fierce about their personal equipment and superstitions, accepted this arrangement without complaint. They understood they were all in the same deadly lottery, and anything that improved anyone's odds was worth supporting. Meanwhile, the official military establishment remained blissfully unaware that one of their senior medical officers was running an unauthorized armor program. October 23, 1943 brought the confrontation Malcolm Grow had been simultaneously expecting and dreading since he'd commissioned the first vests 2 months earlier. Major General Rick Anderson, commanding officer of 8th Bomber Command, arrived at Thorpe Abbotts for a routine inspection and found himself watching ground crews removing steel vests from returning bomber crews. The vests were covered with fresh impact marks, clear evidence of recent combat use. Anderson, a by-the-book commander who believed strongly in proper chains of command and official procurement procedures, immediately demanded an explanation for equipment he'd never authorized. The meeting in Grow's office was tense from the opening words. Anderson, his uniform immaculate despite the muddy English autumn, demanded to know by whose authority a colonel, even a senior medical officer, had commissioned and distributed non-standard protective equipment without approval. From ordnance, without testing by the Army Air Forces Board, without authorization from Army Air Forces headquarters. The regulations were clear. All equipment issued to combat personnel required extensive testing, approval through proper channels, and official procurement procedures. Grow had violated every single protocol. The colonel's response was to present his evidence. 73 documented cases of airmen who'd sustained direct flak hits while wearing the vests and survived wounds that would have been fatal without protection. He showed Anderson the vests themselves, displaying the impact craters, the deformed steel plates, the clear evidence of lives saved. He presented statistical analyses showing that crews wearing the vests had a 70% reduction in flak casualties. He showed photographs of young men, smiling and alive, standing next to the vests that had saved them, alongside names of their squadron mates who'd died from identical wounds to unprotected bodies. Anderson listened, his expression unreadable as Grow made his case. The general was no stranger to the casualties his bomber crews suffered. He'd personally attended too many memorial services, had written his own share of letters to grieving families. But he was also responsible for maintaining discipline, following proper procedures, ensuring that the massive military machine functioned according to established rules. Allowing individual officers, regardless of their good intentions, to simply bypass official channels would create chaos across the entire command structure. The general's verdict was precisely what Grow had feared. All distribution of the unauthorized vests would cease immediately pending a full investigation by the Inspector General's office. The existing vests would be collected and held pending a determination of whether they met official safety standards. Colonel Grow would submit a formal after-action report justifying his actions, and the matter would be referred to Army Air Forces headquarters for determination of appropriate disciplinary action. The meeting ended with Anderson walking out, leaving Grow contemplating the very real possibility that his career was over. But something unexpected happened in the 3 days between Anderson's departure and the arrival of the Inspector General's team. The bomber crews themselves intervened in the most effective way possible. They went directly to their commander. Not through official channels, not the formal complaints, but with a simple delegation of officers and enlisted men who requested a meeting with General Anderson. 27 men, representing 5 different bomb groups, appeared at his headquarters. They weren't protesting or making demands. They were providing testimony as combat veterans about equipment that had saved their lives. These weren't green recruits or men prone to exaggeration. Several wore distinguished flying crosses. Some had completed their required 25 missions and volunteered to fly again. Their message was direct. Colonel Grove's vests had saved their lives, would save hundreds more lives, and any delay in producing them would result in unnecessary deaths of American airmen. November 8, 1943 arrived with a cold rain that turned the English airfields into seas of mud, grounding most bomber operations, but providing perfect conditions for the Inspector General's investigation into what was officially being called the Unauthorized Armor Incident. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Kelsey, a career officer known for his strict interpretation of military regulations, arrived at Thorpe Abbotts with a team of 3 investigators and a brief that was clear: determine whether Colonel Grove had violated procurement regulations and, if so, recommend appropriate disciplinary action. Kelsey's investigation lasted 6 days and became something quite different from what he'd anticipated when he left Washington. He began by examining the procurement records, confirming that Grove had indeed commissioned the vests using medical supply funds, a clear violation of budget regulations. The colonel had failed to obtain approval from the Ordnance Department, violated equipment standardization protocols, and distributed non-approved protective gear to combat personnel. By the letter of military law, Grove was guilty of multiple violations that could result in court-martial and dismissal from service. But Kelsey was also required to investigate the equipment's effectiveness, and that's where his investigation took an unexpected turn. He interviewed 78 airmen who'd worn the vests in combat, reviewing medical records for each case where flak impacts had been documented. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. The vests were stopping projectiles that would otherwise have caused serious injury or death. He examined 23 vests that had been struck in combat, conducting his own ballistic analysis with recovered flak fragments. The metallurgy was sound. The design was practical. The protection was real. The turning point in Kelsey's investigation came during an interview with Captain John Fordham, a pilot who'd lost 3 crew members to flak on a mission before the vests were available, then flew 6 subsequent missions with his crew wearing Grove's armor. Fordham had kept meticulous records of every flak hit his aircraft sustained, documenting with photographs and incident reports that his crew had survived 14 direct hits that struck men wearing the vests. His bombardier, Lieutenant Robert Chen, had been hit 3 separate times on a single mission over Bremen. Without the vest, he would have died in the aircraft. With it, he completed the bomb run, helped navigate the damaged aircraft back to England, and was flying again within a week. According to contemporary accounts documented in the official Army Air Force's historical records, particularly the multi-volume strategic bombing survey completed after the war, Kelsey's investigation concluded that while Colonel Grove had technically violated multiple regulations, his actions had unquestionably saved American lives and demonstrated initiative consistent with the highest traditions of military service. The investigation report, submitted on November 14, 1943, recommended that no disciplinary action be taken and further recommended immediate official adoption and mass production of the protective vests. The response from Washington came with unexpected speed, driven by the mounting casualty rates from the intensifying strategic bombing campaign. On December 1, 1943, the War Department authorized immediate production of what was now officially designated the M12 flak vest, with specifications based directly on Grove's unauthorized design. The Ordnance Department, setting aside their bruised institutional pride, fast-tracked the production contracts. The Wilkinson Sword Company received a massive order, and American manufacturers including the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company were contracted to produce additional units. The official recognition went beyond mere adoption of the design. Colonel Grove received a commendation for his initiative, though the commendation carefully avoided mentioning that his initiative had violated multiple regulations. More importantly to Grove himself, the first 5,000 vests began arriving at 8th Air Force bases in England by mid-December. January 15, 1944, witnessed the beginning of what military logisticians would later call one of the most rapid equipment deployments in Army Air Force's history. The production lines at Wilkinson Sword's London facility and Firestone's manufacturing plants in Ohio were operating around the clock, churning out M12 flak vests at a rate of nearly 1,000 units per week. By the end of January, Over 13,000 vests had been distributed to bomber crews across England, and production was accelerating to meet the demand from expanding bomber forces. But the mass production revealed challenges that the small-scale prototype phase hadn't exposed. The first batches of vests from American manufacturers showed significant quality variations. Some steel plates were too soft, deforming excessively under impact and causing more severe blunt trauma injuries. Others were too brittle, developing stress fractures after multiple missions. The canvas backing material in some batches deteriorated rapidly in the damp English climate, and the adjustment straps frequently broke under the stress of men climbing in and out of aircraft while wearing the heavy vests. Malcolm Grow, now working officially with the Ordnance Department rather than around them, established a quality control program that was unusual for military equipment of the era. Every vest returned from combat with documented flak impacts was sent to a central facility at Bovingdon, where metallurgists, engineers, and medical personnel examined the damage patterns. The vests became their own testing ground, providing real-world data about what worked and what needed improvement. This battlefield feedback loop resulted in rapid design iterations that improved both protection and comfort. The vest design evolved through several generations during the first 6 months of production. The M12A variant, introduced in March 1944, featured improved steel alloy in the plates based on analysis of combat damage patterns. The canvas backing was replaced with a more durable cotton duck material that better withstood the harsh conditions of bomber operations. Weight was reduced by 8 ounces through better plate geometry, and the vest now included additional small plates protecting the groin area. Responding to casualty reports showing that men were being wounded by flak coming up through the aircraft floor, the statistical evidence of the vest's effectiveness became impossible to dispute, even by the most skeptical military analysts. Casualty reports from January through March 1944 showed a 43% reduction in fatal flak wounds among crews equipped with the vest compared to earlier missions flown without protection. Non-fatal wounds requiring medical evacuation dropped by 38%. These weren't small sample sizes or statistical anomalies. These were results from thousands of combat sorties flown by tens of thousands of airmen. The vests were saving lives on a scale that justified every bit of trouble Malcolm Grow had caused by his unauthorized initiative. The success of the bomber crew vests led to rapid expansion of the body armor program across other Army Air Forces roles. Fighter pilots initially resisted wearing armor, claiming it restricted mobility in the tight confines of their cockpits, but a modified design called the M13 proved acceptable. By April 1944, even transport crews flying supply missions over the Himalayas into China were being equipped with protective vests. The concept that Grow had pioneered through his unauthorized experiment had become standard operating procedure across all air combat operations. The psychological impact of the vests extended beyond their physical protection. Crews reported feeling more confident, more willing to hold their positions during intense flak barrages rather than breaking formation to avoid the worst concentrations. This improved bombing accuracy and reduced the number of missions required to destroy specific targets. June 6, 1944, D-Day, brought the largest air operation in history and the most severe test yet of the flak vest program. 9,000 aircraft supported the Normandy invasion, and bomber crews wearing Malcolm Grow's design flew through unprecedented concentrations of German anti-aircraft fire. The casualty statistics from that day and the weeks following provided both vindication and sobering reality about the limits of protective equipment. The vests saved hundreds of lives during the invasion period, but they also couldn't save everyone. Men still died, sometimes wearing vests that had protected them on previous missions, but couldn't stop the particular fragment that found a gap in coverage or hit with enough force to defeat the steel plates. Technical Sergeant William Hastings from Iowa survived 14 missions wearing his vest, each time sustaining impacts that would have killed him without protection. On his 15th mission, a direct flak burst below his aircraft, sent a large fragment upward at a steep angle, striking him in the gap between the vest's lower plates and his flight suit. He bled out before his crew could get him to an aid station. His death devastated Malcolm Grow, who attended the funeral and later wrote in his private journal that every life saved made him grateful beyond words. But every death despite the vests felt like a personal failure. These losses drove continued innovation in protective equipment design. The M14 vest, introduced in August 1944, added articulated lower plates that overlapped to reduce gaps in coverage. Weight had increased again to 26 pounds, but by this point in the war, CI.RUs accepted the additional burden willingly. Combat experience had taught them that the exhaustion from wearing heavy armor was far preferable to the alternative. Some crews began wearing the vests even during training missions, preferring to build their endurance with the equipment they'd depend on in combat. The data collection and analysis program that GROW had established produced insights that extended beyond personal armor. Engineers noticed patterns in where aircraft were being hit most frequently and began designing additional armor plates for installation in aircraft themselves, protecting critical crew positions. The ball turret, previously a death trap for gunners hit by flak from below, received steel plating underneath based directly on wound pattern analysis from the vest program. Similar protective measures were added to cockpit floors, navigator positions, and radio operator stations. By September 1944, nearly all bomber crews in the European theater were equipped with flak vests, and production had begun for crews preparing for operations against Japan. The vests had become as standard as parachutes and oxygen masks, essential equipment that no crew would consider flying without. New replacement crews arriving in England received their VSS during initial processing, along with training on proper fitting and maintenance. The vests required care. The steel plates needed inspection for cracks. The canvas backing required weatherproofing treatment, and the adjustment straps had to be checked regularly for wear. The program's success attracted attention from other nations. British bomber crews, who'd started using body armor before the Americans, adopted several design improvements from GROW's vests. Soviet representatives requested samples and technical specifications, though whether they actually produced their own versions remained unclear through the chaos of wartime communication. Even German intelligence services took interest. Recovered documents after the war showed Luftwaffe analysts had studied captured American vests and recommended similar protection for their own diminishing bomber forces, though Germany's collapsing industrial capacity made large-scale production impossible. The human dimension of the vest program continued to manifest in countless individual stories. Letters to Malcolm GROW from airmen who'd survived because of the vests filled several file boxes in his office. Mothers and wives wrote thanking him for saving their sons and husbands. April 26, 1945, found Malcolm GROW in his office at 8th Air Force Headquarters, now located at Displaced Persons Facilities near Frankfurt, Germany, reviewing casualty statistics from the nearly completed European Air War. The numbers told a story that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier when he'd stood in a surgical tent watching young men die from preventable wounds. Over the previous 18 months of intense combat operations, equipped bomber crews had experienced casualty rates from flak wounds that were 63% lower than comparable missions flown before the vests became standard equipment. The statistical analysis conducted by Army Air Force's medical staff estimated that the M12 flak vest and its variants had prevented approximately 13,000 serious wounds and saved roughly 4,000 American lives during the European air campaign. These weren't speculative projections. They were conservative estimates based on documented cases where airmen sustained direct flak impacts while wearing vests, impacts that ballistic analysis confirmed would have been fatal or severely wounding to unprotected bodies. The actual number of lives saved was likely higher, impossible to calculate precisely because there was no way to know how many hits the vest stopped, without the wearer even realizing they'd been struck by small fragments. The success of the flak vest program had implications that extended far beyond World War II. The concept of personal body armor for military personnel, virtually abandoned after World War I, was now proven effective with modern materials and design. The research and development process that GROW had pioneered, using battlefield damage analysis to drive rapid design iterations, became standard methodology for military equipment development. The integration of medical personnel into equipment design, ensuring that protective gear addressed actual combat wound patterns rather than theoretical threats, influenced how the military approached soldier protection for decades afterward. Recognition for GROW's contribution came in various forms, though the colonel himself remained characteristically modest about his role. He received the Legion of Merit for his development of the flak vest program, And after the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey officially credited his initiative with significantly reducing American casualties during the air campaign. More meaningful to Grow were the reunions with aircrew members who'd survived because of the vests, men who went on to live full lives, raise families, and build careers that would have been cut short over the skies of Germany without his unauthorized intervention. The post-war accounting also revealed the bureaucratic courage that several senior officers had demonstrated in supporting Grow, despite his violation of regulations. General Frederick Anderson, who'd initially confronted Grow about the unauthorized vests, had quietly delayed official censure while allowing the program to prove itself. His actions protected Grow from more hostile headquarters staff who wanted to make an example of the colonel's insubordination. Anderson never sought credit for this protection, but private correspondence discovered years later showed he'd deliberately run interference with Washington bureaucrats while the battlefield results accumulated. The flak vest program's influence extended into the Cold War era and beyond. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, American troops received body armor descended directly from Grow's designs. The M51 vest worn by Korean War soldiers used improved materials, but followed the same basic principles: overlapping plates, protecting vital organs, weight distributed to avoid excessive fatigue, design informed by actual combat wound analysis. Vietnam-era body armor, though constructed from new materials like ceramic plates and nylon, still reflected Grow's insight that protection didn't require invulnerability, just the ability to stop the most common threats. Modern military body armor, worn by American forces in conflicts from the Gulf War through Afghanistan and Iraq, represents the technological evolution of what Malcolm Grow started with his unauthorized steel vests. Today's interceptor body armor and enhanced combat helmet systems use advanced materials like Kevlar and Spectra fiber, but they embody the same principle Grow fought for: that protecting soldiers' lives justifies challenging bureaucratic inertia and accepted practices. Malcolm Grow retired from military service in 1946 with the rank of Major General, having served as air surgeon throughout the war's conclusion. He lived until 1960, long enough to see body armor become standard equipment for American military personnel, and to receive letters from veterans who credited him with their survival. His unauthorized experiment with steel vests, which could have ended his career, instead saved thousands of lives and changed military doctrine permanently. The lesson of his story remains relevant. Sometimes the courage to act without permission, when lives are at stake and bureaucracy moves too slowly, represents the highest form of military leadership. The bomber crews who flew through flak-filled skies over Europe, protected by unauthorized steel plates commissio, led by a surgeon who cared more about saving lives than following regulations, never forgot what Malcolm Grow's initiative meant for them and their families. They were the living proof that one person's determination to solve a problem, regardless of institutional obstacles, could change the course of history for thousands of others.